Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm Kayla McGowan, Editor-in-Chief, and today our special guest is Shawn Havalotti. He has a career spanning over a decade in the general construction industry. He's been a driving force in restoration and remediation since 2006, and he started in this industry at just 16, where he's worked in various roles and companies, including a significant tenure with one of the industry's largest firms. Shawn holds multiple credentials, including IICRC certifications, ASHE training, and CCITI healthcare remediator certification. His expertise has led him to two nationally showcased fire restoration projects that were featured on television and in the magazines. From managing 6 to 7 figure projects and overseeing every detail from the initial loss to the final delivery to hands-on roles like extraction and selective demolition, Shawn's comprehensive experience has covered every single portion of the industry. Today, we're going to dive into the leading cause of commercial water damage, and we're really going to focus on Shawn's expertise and experience to better understand some key factors and key ways to prevent costly damage to commercial properties. So, with that being said, please welcome Shawn Havalotti.
Thank you, Kayla. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I know for those of you that don't know, we went through some natural disasters and scheduling, and here we are. We finally get to have this conversation. I know it's extremely important, and you know, prevention is really key in our space, but also understanding the key root of the problem is even more important. So I just kind of want to talk about like what made you start in the industry at, the ripe age of 16, right?
So I started in construction, working for my grandfather-in-law and just trying to make extra money, and then naturally there was an economic decline around that time, and restoration was a natural fit when I turned 18 and just kind of never looked back.
Yeah, and it's been I know you've seen some things, right? Since 16 all the way to now, and just it's the industry has evolved as a whole, but I think some key things stay pretty constant, and that is, surrounding just water damage in general, but in the commercial space, I think there's some leading causes that we should discuss, right? So from where you sit, what are maybe the top 3 to 5 leading causes of, commercial water damage?
Sure, probably the biggest one is plumbing, sprinkler failures, malfunctions, or some sort of damage that caused the water to infiltrate the building. And I would say the number two is going to be building envelope failures, lack of general maintenance uh, in regards to that. And the third is unfortunately just carelessness, just people doing things. I mean, I've done stuff where a janitor just unfortunately left the sink running, and that caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage. So, in my experience, those are the three most common causes of water damage in structures, whether that be, I know we're talking about commercial, but that applies on the residential aspect too.
I was just gonna follow up with that. Like, how does it differ from residential, if it even does, right? I know some people may think that they're kind of night and day, but those who really work closely with both of them understand like it's very similar. It's just on a bigger scale, right? I think that's the way we should think about it, right?
Typically, yeah. I mean, the leading causes don't differ too much. It's the damages. When you're in a commercial building, there's so many mechanicals running through things, and water's always going to find the path of least resistance. So when you got a building that's 8 floors with penetrations, with electrical, plumbing, mechanical running through those, that water is going to find those weak spots and just follow the path of least resistance. Whereas in residential, typically you're going 2, maybe 3 stories high. So the water travels the same, but there's just less area to impact.
Yeah, and I was gonna say if you like look at the metropolitan areas where they have these huge structures, whether they're, 20 feet or I mean 20 stories, excuse me, or going into the skyscraper realm, water travels the same way gravity does, right? So like if you imagine an issue at the top, it could eventually reach the bottom, maybe even before it's noticed, right? I think we do sometimes see that in some losses that are talked about. I know you mentioned plumbing. So plumbing could be broad. I know you mentioned sprinklers, but what are the other types of initial failures, I guess we can say, that leads to a water damage or loss?
Sure. It's fittings. Fittings tend to fail a lot. That could be from improper installation, maybe the soldering or the fitting wasn't applied correctly if it's PEX. Or it could just be wear and tear. You get erosion a lot of times. Or if you're talking about the Northeast, we don't deal with it too much in Florida, but you get those deep freezes and when water freezes, it turns to ice and expands, and those pipes aren't made for that expansion typically. So you get any weak spot in that metal, that could be a manufacturing issue or, again, back to installation. Not to throw any trade under the bus, but that's more often than not where you see plumbing failures.
What I was going to say too, right? Materials have changed over time. I know we have a lot of buildings across the United States and really throughout the world that have been up for well over 100 years. Can you imagine what they used and what's changed? I mean, some stuff that we see now, especially with weather or natural disasters, they may not have been as prominent then. And so with plumbing could come issues. I mean, you talked about corrosion. That happens over time, not just over time, but the elements it's exposed to as well, right? Um, can you kind of talk about, how we can see the warning signs if there is an issue with plumbing? What can we look out for? What can we tell our consumers to look out for, especially if they're, even if it's residential, but also in the commercial space, right? I know a lot of times we probably walk into a building and we like see a ceiling tile and we're like, oh, there's water damage, but what are the other signs or tall tales that we should look for?
Well, sure. Corrosion's pretty obvious. Typically, you'll see most homeowners and most commercial people have seen it too. You'll see that green around a fitting. A lot of times, if it's cleaned up right then and there, you can, take care of it, maybe resolder the joint if anything is showing any signs of weakness. But it's just staying on top of it. Don't let that build up. You get rust too, and rust is a cancer to metal. So that's if you see anything rusty, you got to looking for water flow problems. If your water pressure is significantly dropped, you probably got a leak somewhere. Here in Florida, a lot of things are underground with the slab, and technically we're built on a high water table. A lot of salt water that can corrode metal very, very easily, and
Yeah.
those are leaks that are hard to find because they're underground. So you won't realize it till you start to notice water pressure or bubbling on the surface or tiles coming loose, things of that nature. But it's just generally being aware and taking the time to do maintenance checks is how you can prevent it.
I was about to say, like, what preventative measures can you take? I think we all, we know that there's problems, but there's also ways to maintain and kind of get ahead of any problem that you may see or eventually have. And I think that's one of those things like, how many times have you gone somewhere and maybe like the sink is a little slow to drain or what have you? And you're like, okay, that's a problem. But then it becomes a bigger problem if it's not addressed, right? Especially in the commercial space. If you think about restaurants or grocery stores or what have you, sometimes they just don't have that manpower or the resource to take care of that. And I'm just curious, have you seen a lot of losses that kind of root from that, like the sink, like you mentioned with the janitor, maybe like a toilet? Are those like your number one and twos probably in the plumbing space?
Our number one in plumbing space is plumbing failures versus overflows for the most
Interesting.
part. And the plumbing failures, sometimes you can find stuff and be preventative, and sometimes it's unknown. I mean, things are buried in wall cavities, like I said, in slabs. There's no real way to know that something's getting weak, unfortunately. But you
Yeah.
just got to use your best judgment and look around at the things you can look at. Inspect under the sinks, inspect the your shut off valves, and just really try to make sure you don't have loss of water pressure is really the main thing you can try to control. There's a lot of unknowns without demoing a structure, and seeing what's going on with the bones.
Yeah, that's true. I was gonna say the next one you said was like the building envelope, just as a whole, right? And I think we have to think of it as a bigger picture. I just literally had a conversation about the building envelope yesterday with one of my colleagues that I've known for the last 10 years. And we were talking about, how everything is almost interconnected as far as cleaning, restoration, inspection, health and safety. And if something doesn't work in that building envelope, something is bound to fail, right? Can you
Sure.
explain a little bit about that where you see those failures? I know plumbing is could be part of the case, but maybe it's like the HVAC or maybe it's the roof, right? I think we see a lot of cases where there was an improper roof or maybe there was a leak that didn't go attended to. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So here in Florida, we deal with a lot of stucco on CMU block. And, they're building houses really, really fast down here. So one of the most common things we're encountering right now is improper sealant before the stucco goes on. And what happens is that becomes a hidden building envelope damage. You don't see the signs until your sheathing and framing starts to kind of rot out, and then you get that nasty M word, the mold on the surface of your gypsum board, and then you start investigating. I mean, we got one right now we just looked at, and it looks like we're gonna have to redo a whole elevation of a residential home. And it all stems from just one area where the soffit didn't have the proper flashing and maybe a 1 foot strip. But once that water got behind that stucco and wasn't draining properly, because stucco is designed for some water to get behind it, but not a significant amount, and it just starts to deteriorate. And it attracts also, I mean, water can attract unnecessary guests too. You might get termites attracted to a carpenter ants and other little critters that you definitely don't want inside the walls and affecting the framing.
Well, speaking of that, how often do you see that happen where maybe there is a loss? It doesn't have to be water, but there is some type of loss that it essentially invites unwanted guests, right? So I know like in roofing, essentially sometimes there's the ventilation has holes in it, right? And then you get squirrels or what have you. What do we see in our space that becomes a really big issue? You said termites. I know in some parts of the country that's really big. Um, I'm in Las Vegas. We have a huge pigeon population, and literally it's so disgusting. I can only imagine, right? Like having some type of loss. We had a fire down the street not that long ago, and it took them a minute to get it boarded up. And I'm thinking it's the summer, it's hot, not to mention birds and things like that. But sometimes there's stray cats, right? How do we prevent that? And how are those also sometimes telltale signs of maybe there's a situation going on?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're starting to see unnecessary unwanted guests or critters, bugs, things of that nature, there's probably a penetration open somewhere that they're gaining access to, and you got to kind of do a perimeter check. And back to the maintenance question, you should be here in Florida. Again, we have a lot of stucco. You find a crack in your stucco, you should be diligent and try to seal those cracks and check your windows, doors yearly for the silicone caulking around the perimeter of them. And those are like real easy steps to do that are very, very maintenance, but it can be a sign that there's a bigger issue. Sure.
I was gonna say prevention, right? And just proactiveness instead of reactiveness makes a world of difference. We have a lot of stucco here as well. We also have a lot of settlement issues just in general, I would say. And I don't know how many times you go somewhere and you just see like this running crack or, maybe there was a leak at one point and people think, oh, it's like Las Vegas, it's dry, but it could lead to other problems, right? Which I think is extremely important, especially when we're talking like about a sound structure, right? You have some type of imperfection, it can lead to so much imperfectness and some issues later down the road, especially if we're talking about like a water loss, right? So let's say you're having a water loss and you happen to have some settlement cracks or something like that. Um, could there be an initial miss by, let's say, maybe the tenant, not necessarily the professional, but maybe like the tenant? They're like, oh, we cleaned it up or whatever, and we kind of notice there's like a smell or like it feels damp, right? Is that how do we how do we build awareness, and how do we as professionals like explain to our customers, hey, this is what you need to do in order to keep yourself safe. Like we're going to help you, but next time something like this happens, instead of trying to clean it up yourself, maybe call a professional. That's what professionals are for.
Sure. And most restoration contractors, they'll offer some sort of free assessment, come out and do a moisture check, because I mean, naturally they want to be rewarded if they find something with the project. But if you smell something that's not normal to your home or to your building space, it's definitely good to get a restoration professional or, if it's significant, an IH involved, and they can run some air tests, run some moisture checks and see if there's a bigger problem going on. And maybe it was something surface, but more often than not, if there's a intrusive smell in the home, I would say my experience, more than 80% of the time, there's some sort of water intrusion causing it.
But I was also going to say, a lot of times you can't see with the eye, right? That's the beauty of having thermal imaging and the moisture tests and all that. I think we have the resources that our customers don't have. And that's extremely important because I think a lot of times, we all see it where someone's like, "Oh, my sink overflowed," or what have you, but there could be a crack in your, tile. There could be, I mean, there's how many times have you probably gone into a restroom where they've had so much water damage or exposure in between maybe like their laminate and their tub, and it's just never been an issue until it was, right? Um, and speaking of that, I think the third thing you talked about was maybe lack of knowledge or carelessness. I know that's not really by us in the professional space, right? It's our job to make sure. But, where do you see it most, right? Like in the commercial space, do you see it, like what types of situations or spaces do you see that the most in with the carelessness or maybe lack of knowledge?
Sure, sure. So you see it a lot of time in storage closets in the commercial space. They get over time, over say 20 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be, they start storing things, and someone's not paying attention and they block some sort of valve or some sort of riser pump or something, and then that has some corrosion or God knows what, some sort of pinhole, but it's hidden by all the stuff hiding it. And then by the time it's known, it becomes a really big problem. I mean, those sprinklers, those riser pumps, they put out a tremendous amount of water. So when that pinhole decides to finally go and fully break, and that becomes a really large issue. That's probably the most common in commercial space on the carelessness. You do see, just maintenance guys tend to sometimes make a mistake, or if they're doing a remodel. I mean, we just had one in Daytona. The remodel contractor, thought that they had shut off the water to a space and they didn't. So they're just tearing it out and not doing that secondary check to make sure the water's not live. And next thing you know, they got a six-figure loss on their hands.
Ugh. Oh, that's it. Something that could have been prevented, right? Like that, I
That,
think that's what we come back to is prevention, right? And there's, like you said, depending on where you live, there are annual assessments or inspections that can help. But what are some ways that we can maybe emphasize importance to our customers, right? Because at the end of the day, it does come down to the customer. And time is money, and sometimes people take shortcuts, whether it's the consumer or maybe we deal with like tenants in a space, right? I think that's probably you deal with that quite a bit as well. Um, how do we provide that knowledge to them?
so a lot of that is honestly having the general conversation, and it's just making yourself aware, whether that be through Google searches. You can't believe everything on the internet, but there is good information out there. And just contacting professionals with any sort of questions or any concerns, and just allowing the professional to educate you, and allowing people to inspect it. With the tenant situation, we found they're not so concerned most with maintenance, so I mean, I would say probably refer that back to the owner. They have the investment that they need to protect, and they should probably build into their lease agreement that they can do quarterly checks on the property and have some sort of checklist that you're going to do the maintenance on. A lot of good things on the market now too are the flow check valves that they're getting more affordable. I think they're on average like $400 now. We can hook it into your water supply run, and it'll tell you if there's a drop in water pressure remotely. So even if you have a tenant and you're not there, you start to see unnecessary drops. That's normally a sign of, hey, I got to go do a property check, and take a look at what's going on over there.
Well, I was going to say, you kind of touched on this, and speaking from experience, the water company came out and they did their annual assessment or quarterly, whatever it was, and they actually sent us a message like, hey, we noticed that you have a consistent flow of water. We think you have a leak, essentially. And of
Sure.
course, it was the toilet, which is pretty common, right, over time. Thankfully, it was in the bowl of the toilet. It wasn't in the wall or anything like that. But if that wouldn't have happened, it would still be a problem today. How often are you guys seeing stuff like that, especially like in the tenant space, right? Because as a tenant, most tenants are like, well, I can just move if I have a problem. But for the owner, that's a huge problem.
So here in Florida, it's a very, very highly rented population. I mean, there's definitely a lot of owners, but there is a lot of renters here in Florida, even on a single family residential home. So I would say 50% of our work, we are working with tenants, and a lot of the stuff we find probably could have been prevented or avoided if it was owner occupied, because again, they have the invested interest. They tend to care a little more, take a little better care of things. Whereas, and I'm not dogging on tenants or anything, but if it's not your investment, you tend to probably not show as much attention when things are going wrong. So you start to get like some buildup, some calcium buildup on a shower head or something. A tenant's probably not going to pay much attention to that, whereas an owner might say, "Oh, maybe I should change this shower head out," and
Yeah.
before it builds up and creates some backlog in the pipes or something. Whereas again, a tenant is just going to be like, "Oh, that's the landlord's problem. Well, we're going to move out in 2 years," or whatever the case is. So.
I think you touched on a good point too about the calcium buildup. What can that do behind the wall, right? I know you can see it outside, but what does it do behind the wall, kind of concealed?
So it depends a lot on what the construction of the pipes are, but it can cause a lot of, internal restrictions on water flow as it builds up. Especially, so I'm from the Northeast, and up there we would deal with it a lot in the pipes, and it would start to block your water flow. So you would get water pressure drops in your fixtures. And then over time, that water, I mean, that pressure is coming, coming, coming. So then at some point, it's going to find the weak spot and break at the weak spot because it's not flowing correctly. And there's some measures you could do to that, a saltwater system, different ways. I mean, I would talk to your local plumber on the best methods. That changes so much. It's not my field. I don't keep up with it all that much, but there is measures to prevent it, but it definitely can cause some issues if you're not paying attention, trying to prevent it.
Yeah, I was gonna say it also this goes the same in commercial space, right? We
Yep.
have faucets and some commercial spaces have showers, right? I mean, they
100%.
do, and there's just so much that can happen. And like you said, plumbers are going to be our savior and our safety net and our expert that we lean on, right? Because they're going to be able to tell us and help us just as much as we can help them. So while we're talking about this, what are some like actual practical preventative steps for commercial property owners, right? Because at the end of the day, it does come down to them and how they can reduce their own risk to having what could be a costly loss, right?
Sure. In regards to like a buildup within the pipes,
I
is
mean,
that
just in general, maybe like, because it comes from the roof, it comes from pipes, it comes from carelessness. I know there's going to be different avenues, but I think sometimes when people think of prevention, they think it's a lot of work or they have to hire somebody. I think a lot of times people do think, oh, it's not really my expertise, but what are some practical ways that they can start to implement that can help prevent this issue for them?
Sure. I would say probably the biggest thing again is going back to, quarterly property checks and really, really taking the time to walk the property and not rush through it. Take your time, really look at things. If you're starting to see, we have a lot of asphalt shingles, you start to see those start to curl up or start to shrink from sun damage, start to pay attention to it, and just really, really being diligent on walking the property and paying attention to what's going on, around the windows. Again, that seems to be a really common thing. I mean, we're not talking big damage, but if it's not addressed timely, it turns into big damage. Decks are a big, big thing. The deck flashing, those tend to, no matter how well they're installed over the course of some time, start to erode away and need to be readdressed. And you can see the signs, some soft wood around the slider, let's say, walking onto the deck, things of that nature. So I don't think there's any magic trick to it. It's just you got to do your due diligence and take your
Yeah.
time and really, really inspect your property. And a lot of times the signs are going to visually be there. They're going to be pretty obvious. If you see a crack or you see something starting to peel up that wasn't there last quarter, you should probably do something. And I mean, you can get some silicone caulking at the store for $4 that could prevent you a $5,000 water damage, believe it or not. So,
Yeah.
and it sounds so silly, but we see it every day.
I was gonna say, would you rather spend that $4 that might be a tiny inconvenience because you have to go to the store, or would you be faced with, a $5,000 bill essentially at the end of the day? I mean, it
Yeah.
should be a no-brainer, but I do understand, convenience and things like that. And sometimes you may notice it, and then because you see it every day, you're like, oh, it's nothing, but it may take somebody else saying like, hey, I think there's some discoloration there or something. Like it's not looking right, right? I think you see that in especially linoleum, like the older grocery stores. A lot of them have linoleum, and you can tell where they may have had freezers before, and there was probably some type of intrusion or situation, and they kind of just were like, let's just pick these up, move them essentially. I think you said it best. Just being proactive. That's why assessments and inspections are a thing. They serve a purpose. And now that we've talked about kind of the problem, some solutions, what are some lessons that you think have been learned maybe in your time, not necessarily your own lessons, but maybe from a consumer standpoint, like they were like, "Oh, lesson learned. I did see this. Like this was a tall tale sign, Can you give some details on that as far as, it could be commercial or residential, but what was the key takeaway of that lesson or lessons that were learned?
So one of the things that we see a lot, and whether it be commercial maintenance managers or residential, is they'll have a shutoff valve that has that one little drip,
Mm.
and they're just like, oh, I'll deal with it, I'll deal with it, I'll deal with it. And then they don't necessarily deal with it till that shutoff valve breaks, and then they're unaware where their main shutoff is. And by the time they find it, now, they got 10,000 gallons of water in their home, right? Or hot water heaters. You start to see the rust along the bottom, and this is in the commercial space too. I mean, we just had a $700,000 loss from a water heater,
Mm.
where that bottom pan does start to rust out. I mean, that water, you got to think about what's happening. It fills up, and then it's on demand. So that water in the bottom is just sitting there for God knows how long. Because very rarely does a water heater drain out, and that water is just sitting on metal and it
Oh,
will
oof.
rust out. So when you start to see that rust band on the bottom, it's probably time to engage a plumber and see if how much life you might really have left in that tank. And it's one of those things. People look at it every day and they're like, "Oh, it's not a problem yet," but not realizing that that's $1,000 fix now,
Mm.
but that could turn into an insurance claim and a out of your home for a few months for in worst case scenarios, and thousands of dollars in damage in the long run.
I'm glad you touched on the water heater thing because I personally That was my loss. I had a loss. We purchased a home and we moved in May and we had a loss in August, right? It passed the inspection, everything, right? To buy the home. We bought the home and we would have never known there was a problem until it was too late because our water heater actually went out. And that was like our saving grace, literally, because it was having problems already. And it was like a $5,000 loss. I mean, thankfully for insurance and all of the things, it worked out. But here in Las Vegas, most water heaters are in the garage. So even if there is a situation, you're looking at probably one exterior wall and maybe one interior wall. But it's still a loss is a loss, right? And uh, of course, it was the call the plumber because right or call the expert in this space, and then it was, oh, we have to refer you actually have some damage, like you're gonna have to replace the box that the water heater sits on. It was all rotted out, and for the life of me I couldn't understand how our house passed inspection. But then it came to me, you have the pan sitting on top of your box, you have the water heater sitting on top of that, the box it's sitting on is usually painted, and you can't
Right.
really see damage under paint or under that pan. And it could have been a mess, right? It could have been a huge mess. But I say all that to say, just by chance, it was a $5,000 loss. It could have been way worse, right? Way
Yeah.
worse.
So in the Northeast, there's water heaters are typically in a water heater closet, and they're more often than not positioned in the middle of the home. And that's so when you're pulling your hot water, it's warm regardless of where you pull it, because you might have a bathroom on one side of the house, whereas, in Las Vegas, it's warm a lot. Here in Florida, it's warm most of the year. The Northeast, it's warm maybe 4 months out of the year. So I mean, they tend to try to keep it keep it centralized so that you're pulling hot water pretty easily. So I mean, when a water heater goes in certain areas, it's more than just your garage, unfortunately.
I was going to say too, I think that homeowners and even business owners, they have to take that type of stuff seriously because you talked about like the utility closet earlier. Most times that's in the central area of a building, right? It needs to be easily accessible. And if you think about it, if it's off an elevator, elevators are usually towards the center of the building most times. And if you have, you know, penetration or anything like that in that area, what does that mean for the surrounding area? Um, in speaking of that, what is the worst or maybe the most extensive loss you've seen that's been surrounding something like that, where it kind of just seeped and kept seeping, under the floor, maybe in the walls, and it could have been something that was a smaller loss and it ended up being a catastrophic situation for them.
So we actually just had one that I can reference because it's really fresh in memory. And it was down here in Florida, and it was a sprinkler pipe, a real old sprinkler pipe. I'm not even sure they make sprinkler pipes like this anymore. It appeared to be cast iron piping.
Oh wow.
And so we're talking a really heavy pipe, 6-inch round. It had a really slow leak, but it was up against an exterior wall. And on this exterior wall was all these built-in cabinets and everything. And so you couldn't see the damage. It was all hidden. And in this pin leak, the sprinkler pipe was actually resting on the trusses. So it turned out it rotted out the trusses, rotted out the pass load of that exterior wall, all the structural frame, and pretty much it turned into reframing a roof, reframing a whole exterior of a building. Plus, when it finally went and that framing dropped and that sprinkler pipe went, then you had also the water damage of all the areas that weren't impacted, but the hidden damage was extremely significant. And God bless that it did happen, because that roof was more than likely going to collapse if it didn't, because that framing load was just it was gone. There was nothing left there. So if that sprinkler pipe didn't go to expose it all, it could have been maybe even a casualty in the space, because that all that weight would have came down, and it was an occupied commercial building. People were in there every day working.
Yeah, that's so scary to think about that. And I think about, like the older industrial buildings, right? Or even buildings that have like that drop ceiling, there could potentially be a lot of threats that lie in between you and what is above you, right? Um, and speaking of all of
Layers.
the, yeah, I was gonna
Layers
say,
is what's scary. So, I mean, in the Northeast and being up there, here in Florida, we don't deal with layers as much. It's a bit newer construction, but in the Northeast, I mean, there's homes that are 250 years old. And as fads change, I guess is maybe the word, or designs change,
yeah,
you'll have layers. I mean, it wasn't uncommon. We would do a water loss up there, and you would have 7 layers of flooring. And then by the time you get to the bottom, you're seeing all this rotted out framing, subflooring that was all just hidden over all the layers of flooring. And you didn't feel the soft spot because they built it up so much that there was all this reinforcement hiding it, which again could have turned into a major disaster had someone not had that disaster not happened. It could have been even worse.
I think you hit that right because if we look at the history of all the things, right, and not just our lifetime, but our parents and our grandparents, there were and there still are a lot of shifts in flooring, right? It used to be a lot of hardwood, and then it was like the carpet trend, right? And the carpet and rugs and all the things, and then back to hardwood, and now there's like luxury vinyl and all of this stuff. If there were people that didn't know the proper way to do things, they're just, like you said, literally layering this stuff on top of each other, right? Like, do you see linoleum staying down and then people are laying whatever they are feeling at the time on top of that and that being an issue too, even in the commercial space, right?
You see it everywhere. Everywhere. I don't think any region is immune to that. And a lot of it could be, people want to remodel and they want to do it cost effectively. So I understand the mindset on it, but it's hard to back to maintenance checks. If the more you're hiding things, the more you're building layers up, the less you're going to be able to see what could be going wrong to do preventive maintenance. You're building layers and I mean, the best moisture meter, I mean, you'd have to get a hammer probe to go, I want to say right now, maybe 6 inches. So it's the more you build that floor up, the less likely you are to find the damage too. And it's
Yeah.
just going to be hidden and causing further damages.
So I think all of this comes back to prevention and being proactive, right? Especially when we know that there's ways that we can provide not just for our customers, but even ourselves, right? We occupy commercial spaces and we also have to treat it as such too. We need to keep our eyes out, even your homes. And a lot of times stuff from shortcuts leads to, hey, maybe I shouldn't have taken that shortcut, right?
Yeah,
Um, do you see that also being like an issue too, like shortcuts? I would definitely say aside from, proactive, inspections or assessments or proper maintenance, do you see a lot of shortcuts being an issue? Like I know the flooring thing is one of them, but maybe even in roofing
100%.
or HVAC, right?
Yeah, the cheapest solution is normally the wrong solution. And that's the best way I could put it. And we see it every day where they fail. I mean, yeah, building products get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but again, the cheaper the product is, you can't rely on that for any sort of decent lifespan, you know. And we see it every day. You see people trying to convert. You'll have a half run of a plumbing pipe, and they're putting a PEX on a copper head and not putting the proper fitting to make the transition. Just literally putting their PEX on copper, and it's like, yeah, that was never going to last. Like, what are you doing? But it comes back to lack of education too. I mean, a lot of people are probably economically tight and they're doing what they can to fix it, not realizing the long-term damage they're causing. So that old saying, penny wise, pound foolish.
Yeah, I was gonna say this goes back to my husband says this all the time. Buy it nice or buy it twice. And that's essentially the same thing. You know, take shortcuts, have repercussions, right? I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. And, you know, opportunities like this where we're able to talk about stuff it helps, even if you maybe economically not able to do a course, or maybe you're so busy you can't afford to leave the field. Conversations like this open doors for people that may have not even thought, "Oh, I didn't even think of that," or "Oh, that's a good point. Maybe I should actually look into that," right? Especially for those who are new coming into the industry. I think it's so important that we take the time to collaborate and listen to one another. And honestly, thank you for this. I've learned so much. I've thought about a couple of things that I was like, oh, that makes sense. Maybe we should implement that ourselves. Um, you know, but I'd love to have you on again, and I just want to, thank you for your time today. And if there's any last little tidbit you'd like to share with our listeners, have at it.
All right, Kayla. Well, thank you for having me. I don't really have any extra words of wisdom or anything insightful, but I appreciate your time and thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Well, as always, everybody, we will see you on the next episode of Ask the Expert. Take care.